All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. Back in September, there were some people who were saying that Nick Saban was done and the old ball coach could no longer get the job done. Alabama lost their second game of the season to Texas to drop to 1-1. And in the process, the panic meter was going off in Tuscaloosa. We saw starting quarterback Jalen Milroe benched following the loss to Texas, and the Crimson Tide would follow this up by having to struggle in their next game to get the 17-3 win on the road against South Florida. But following that game against South Florida, Nick Saban decided to go back to Jalen Milroe as his starting quarterback. And honestly, this whole team responded from that. We saw Alabama come out after that and get a 14-point win at home over Ole Miss. And I'll take this time to remind you, Alabama was actually an underdog in that game at home. From there, we saw the Alabama revenge tour as they went out. They got the win over Tennessee after Tennessee beat them on the walk-off win last year, and they did the same against LSU. As this time around, they welcomed both of those clubs to Bryant-Denny Stadium in Tuscaloosa. Now, since the loss to Texas, Alabama has not been blowing teams out, but it's been more like the workmanlike victories for this club, if you will, as their offense has gotten better week by week with Jalen Milroe at quarterback, and then of course Tommy Reese calling the plays. I remember you, if you remember, back in the offseason, when Nick Saban went to Tommy Reese as his new offensive coordinator, bringing him in for Notre Dame. There were a lot of skeptical people down there in Tuscaloosa. And then, of course, following the struggles of this offense early on, there were some people who thought that Tommy Reese could be one and done as Alabama's offensive coordinator as he replaced Bill O'Brien. But that was not the case. Tommy Reese has really entrenched himself, if you will, I think, as Alabama's current play caller. And, he's making a lot of people, eat some crow after they doubted Nick Saban's hire of him. But nonetheless, we've seen this Alabama team get better and better each week, surviving the Iron Bowl last week. And I know I talked about this heading into the Iron Bowl. Hugh Freeze, the new head coach at Auburn, has given Nick Saban a fair share of headaches in the past. If you go back and remember the time when Hugh Freeze was the head ball coach at Ole Miss, his Rebels consistently gave the Crimson Tide and Nick Saban a problem. And that was once again the case uh, between the Plains, between the hedges last week on the Plains at Jordan Hare. But nonetheless, I think that rivalry is really about to heat up in the coming years with Hugh Freeze and Nick Saban. But with that said, Alabama was able to survive. We saw, Jalen Milroe find that moxie to go out there and make that key touchdown pass in the waning seconds of that contest. And of course, Alabama escaped. And, the Crimson Tide came to Atlanta today, 5.5 point underdogs against Georgia. And I've been saying this for a long time. If there is one team that can beat Georgia, it's Alabama. Why? Because they match up so well. Because Kirby Smart, the head coach of Georgia, learned at the feet of Nick Saban. And if you've looked at Kirby Smart's recruiting classes since he's come to Athens, very strong at each level of defense. They have a power ground attack. They have a solid offensive line, and he's built his Georgia program, which has won the last two national championships, just like Nick Saban did in Tuscaloosa when he first got there. Nonetheless, you look back to the Georgia Alabama games in recent years. Of course, we saw these two, meet multiple times in the SEC championship game, meet multiple times for the national championship, and it's been nip and tuck for the most part throughout. And you look at today's contest, and it was no different. And I guarantee you, Nick Saban had obviously he clearly had his team ready to go. And people wanting to write him off, being that he's an older coach, and they're trying to say that Georgia's a new Alabama. But nonetheless, you go back 2 years ago, and I'm not trying to sound like a hater. I'm just being realistic. You go back to that SEC championship game 2 years ago when Alabama dominated Georgia. Okay, we saw Jameson Williams blow out his knee in that game for Alabama. Then John Mechie blew out his knee for Alabama in the national championship game against Georgia. I guarantee you, if both of those guys excuse me, had not gone down with the knee injuries, we would be talking different about that Georgia team in 2021 as far as winning the national championship. No disrespect, but at the end of the day, it simply is what it is. Alabama having the two walk-off losses last year, and we were talking about an Alabama team that went 11-2, and there were some people out there really trying to say if Nick Saban was done. I mean, you look around, how many programs, college football-wise, in the nation would have loved to have had an 11 and 2 season. And for Alabama, they go 11-2, and people are like, well, it's an off year. That's due to the level of excellence that Nick Saban has established in Tuscaloosa. Good luck to whoever is going to go out there and replace him whenever he decides to hang it up. It might be worse than I'm trying to replace Bear Bryant down there. It's going to be a very difficult job. But at the end of the day, Saban can still recruit. He still does. He sends his fair share of talent and then some to the National Football League. He's consistently getting top 5 recruiting classes. Why? Because these youngsters coming out of high school know, hey, this guy's going to give me an opportunity to play high level football in arguably the best conference in college football and giving me an opportunity to get to the National Football League. But you look at this contest today. Georgia started fast, and there were some people who felt that, you know what, Georgia was about to blow out Alabama. Alabama went 3-and-out after receiving the opening kickoff. Georgia marched right down the field, and Kendall Milton scored on a 17-yard run to give the Bulldogs the 7-0 lead. But then we saw this Alabama team as a whole, offensively and defensively, really get it going. This Alabama front four was consistently creating pressure on Georgia quarterback Carson Beck. More importantly, they put the clamps on this Georgia running game. Kendall Milton only had 42 yards on the ground today, and as a team, Georgia only ran for 78 yards. Figure that has been Georgia's bread and butter, even going back to the days of Mark Richt as their head coach, as far as their ability to establish a line of scrimmage with their run game. That did not happen today. This Alabama defense was consistently causing pressure, and after Alabama got it going, they dominated the second quarter. They scored 2 touchdowns. They took the 17-7 lead, and at this point, you knew that Georgia was going to rally. You knew that Georgia was going to have a comeback, which they did. But every time the Georgia rallied, Alabama responded, and I think the biggest one came when Alabama left the door open. And this is a credit to Georgia's defense. That fumble late in the third quarter, where Alabama got the ball at the Georgia 11, and they had to settle for a field goal. That was huge right there, because if the Crimson Tide had scored a touchdown right there to go up 24-10, it might have been all over except for the shouting. Nonetheless, it was 20-10. Georgia did score early in the fourth quarter to make it 20-17, but Alabama came right back. And you figure, the Mercedes-Benz Stadium is, hop, skip, and a jump, if you will, from Athens. Plenty of Georgia fans there, obviously plenty of Alabama fans there. And clearly the momentum at the SEC championship game had shifted, but credit to Jalen Milroe, Tommy Reese and his offense. They put together a phenomenal drive to get the momentum back. And, they scored with just under 6 minutes left in the contest. Roy Dale Williams punched it in from a yard out. But that drive belonged to Jalen Milroe as he took it over with his running and his throwing ability. And that's one thing, you could see the maturation process as far as how comfortable that this young man has been. This offensive line gave Jalen Milroe plenty of time in that pocket. He was pressured at times by this good Georgia defense, but for the most part, he was calm, cool, and collected back there. And then aside from being able to pass the ball like they did today, um, Alabama's offensive line just firing off and opening up things in the run game, both for Jalen Milroe and Roy Dale Williams. We saw Jace McClellan was a no-go today with the injury, and that was big. But under Nick Saban, the Crimson Tide, always the moniker is the next man up, and we saw that again today. And then even when Georgia, scored to make it 27-24, Alabama made them work for it. They had to get the fourth down on that drive twice. And then even after that, people, like the momentum was still shifting back to Georgia. They still had their timeouts. But you know what? Once again, Jalen Milroe stepped up with his smarts, his arm and his legs. Most notably, his legs on that final drive, as he was able to help salt this game away and get out and help Alabama get the 27-24 win. I'll tell you like this. I said probably a month ago, I said there was a two-team SEC scenario once again on the table. Very highly unlikely at this point. And there's going to be some people that are going to say, "Well, how can Alabama get from number 8 up to the top 4?" It has to happen at this point because you figure Ohio State, and I said this last week in losing to Michigan. Ohio State's done. They came in sitting at 6. They're idle, so obviously nothing is going to benefit them at this point, especially with Texas and Alabama winning behind them. Oregon lost and they were 5th. They're going to drop. Florida State is struggling right now as we speak with Louisville, and that's to be expected as the Noles are on the third string quarterback. But Alabama just beat the top team in the land. Alabama just beat a team that hadn't lost since the 2021 SEC championship game. And I've been saying it for a while. If there was one team out there that could beat Georgia, it's Alabama. And it's one of those where that has to account for something. You just won the SEC. You went out there this season. You beat LSU. You beat a good Tennessee team. You beat a good Ole Miss team. It's one of those. And then, of course, today knocking off Georgia. Now, granted, Alabama does have the loss to Texas on their resume. And of course, people are going to rightfully say, well, if you put Alabama in, you got to put Texas in because Texas beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa by 10 points. So we're talking about the Big 12 champions, and we're also talking about the SEC champions. But nonetheless, I think Alabama has done enough to get into the field of 4. And at the end of the day, I said it before and I'll say it again. You simply don't write off Bill Belichick. Pardon me, Nick Saban. I said Bill Belichick because of those days, with Bill Belichick and Tom Brady for so many years in the with the New England Patriots, they won. And then of course, Bill Belichick and Nick Saban, they're hand in hand. Of course, once upon a time when Bill Belichick was the head coach of the Cleveland Browns, Nick Saban was his defensive coordinator. But nonetheless, you simply don't bet against Nick Saban and Alabama this time of the year. And I talked about it from the beginning of the season. Last year, people were trying to write Alabama off. People were trying to say that Georgia was the new Alabama. And Nick Saban simply was not going to take a back seat to that. And this Alabama team, they're not flashy, but this isn't about style points. It's about wins and losses. Alabama's 12-1. They won the SEC, and they are more than deserving and then some of being a part of the college football playoff. Now, in regards to Georgia, they've been the number one team for the bulk of this year. They started off number one. They were number one in the college football playoff rankings. And typically and historically, you would say a team that's number one wouldn't drop that far. They more than likely would still be in the top 4. It's happened before. But this year, at least for the 14 playoff, it's going to be, and it has been an anomaly because you look at it, you've got a darn good Michigan team. I know they're up on Iowa right now. Michigan more than likely is going to win that game. You got Washington. Washington is more than deserving. They won the Pac 12. They're undefeated. And then on top of that, they beat Oregon twice. And then you've got that cluster. You've got Texas. You've got Alabama. You got Georgia. Obviously, Ohio State's been pushed to the side. Oregon's done now. So Ohio State's going to be clearly, bringing up the rear in this equation. But it's going to come down to how far is Georgia going to fall. But you can't put Georgia in over Alabama. I mean, granted, yes, Georgia's a two-time defending champs, but we can't do this off of past accolades. This has got to be the here and now. And just like people are going to say, well, we can't put Alabama over Texas, you can't put Georgia in over Alabama. Alabama won their conference. They beat Georgia. And because of that, I really do think that they're in this field of 4. And it's bittersweet for Georgia that this run is coming to an end, at least for this year. But I'll tell you like this, obviously, going forward, we're not going to have the same discussion due to the expanded college football playoff, the 12-team playoff. And I think, it's going to be good and bad because it's going to limit the arguments. There's still going to be some people arguing about the 13th team getting into the playoff field next year. I guarantee you that. But nonetheless, these conference championship games, they've basically been de facto play-in games to the college football playoff. That might not be the situation once we go to a 12-team playoff next year rather. So I think this time around it only adds to the intensity and the importance of these contests. And again, Georgia, it's been a great run, but it looks like they're probably going to be watching the playoff proceedings from home. I think Alabama's done enough. I know the Texas factor is there, but Alabama, I think they get in. And the question for me is going to be how dangerous will this Alabama team be? I'll tell you like this. I don't know who Alabama's going to play. More than likely, they're going to be the 4 seed. So they're probably either going to play a Michigan or a Washington. So we're probably talking about a trip to Pasadena, more than likely in the Rose Bowl. I'll tell you like this: Alabama travels, and I'm not just talking about their fans. I'm talking about their game, how they go out there and do things. Alabama can run the football. Alabama can play defense, and typically, when you give Nick Saban additional time to cook up a defensive scheme, he can make the best offenses look normal. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think Alabama is going to be very dangerous in the playoff. And I tell you like this: we've seen some good fields of four for the playoff. I'm not sure who's going to get in at this point, but I think this has the makings of arguably being the best field of four since the college football playoff was created. Is going to be the first time around that the folks on the committee, they're going to have to work for their supper, because they got to do a lot of work this time around to figure out who's going to be or who are the best 4 teams to put in this bracket. But nonetheless, Alabama did their part. They upset the apple cart. Best case scenario for the committee would have been if Georgia won, Washington won, Michigan won, Florida State won. You know what? Everything would have taken care of itself. But to quote the great Lee Corso, not so fast, my friend. Things have definitely shifted. Things have definitely changed. But nonetheless, I do feel Alabama has done enough to get to the college football playoff. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on the X, formerly known as Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it'll be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. You can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. Before I sign off, Chelsea Grin, how are you doing this evening? You're saying that the CFP committee, they're going to have to do some soul searching. Somebody, I guarantee you, come 1 or 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon on the East Coast, somebody's going to be upset, because you look at it like this. Obviously, Washington's in. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Michigan, more than likely, they're going to handle their business against Iowa tonight. I know they were leading 10-0 at the half when I started. Florida State, that could be the enigma due to the fact that they're on their third string quarterback and they're struggling with Louisville right now. I'll tell you what, though, if Louisville wins that game, that changes the whole equation of things, as far as, Florida State having, an argument right there. But I will say this: if Florida State does win against Louisville tonight, obviously they would have won the ACC. Obviously, they would have been undefeated. And since the start of the college football playoff, there has never been a Power Five team go undefeated and not make the playoff. But the problem is this: Texas has one loss, yes. Alabama also has one loss as well. But look at the strength of the conferences in comparison to the ACC. Now, Florida State, to begin their season, beat LSU in Orlando, a neutral field. LSU was a top 10 team at the time. Um, excuse me, people expected more out of the Tigers this year, but LSU lost their fair share of games, and obviously that dropped them in the rankings. That was Florida State's best win of the season. They struggled on the road earlier against a Boston College team that they were heavily favored over, and that was with Jordan Travis as their quarterback. They struggled against Clemson in Death Valley, and honestly, you can make a very compelling argument to say Clemson threw that game away. They struggled at home with Miami. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt last Saturday night in the swamp against Florida as they were breaking in a new quarterback and Tate Rodemaker, but so was Florida. And, Florida State had to rally to win that game. And then, of course, tonight they're struggling with Louisville. So it's not really about the style points, but at the end of the day, it's the strength of the conferences. Now, Texas, on the other hand, Texas beat Alabama, and they beat them very convincingly in Tuscaloosa. But, Texas at times has played down to the level of their competition. We've seen them struggle at home, if you will, with some teams that they were supposed to beat. But, they held serve. They lost Jonathan Brooks. They missed Quinn Ewers for some time as well. But, in the last couple of weeks, the Longhorns have turned it on. It's all about the style points. But at the end of the day, you're blowing out Texas Tech and you're blowing out Oklahoma State. No disrespect to Oklahoma State. They weren't the second best team in the Big 12 this year, in my opinion. It's just the fact that they finished tied. If Texas had faced either an Oklahoma or K State, I think they would have gotten more of a contest today. But nonetheless, Oklahoma State beat Oklahoma, and they also beat K State as well. So that's why they're there. But when it's all said and done, Alabama, strong strength of schedule in that conference. They won the SEC West. The SEC West is much stronger than the SEC East. And Alabama just beat Georgia today. So, it's going to be hard to keep Alabama out. It's going to be hard to keep Texas out. And I think this weekend is cannon fodder, if you will, for all of those folks out there that say, you know what, it's time to expand the playoff. I know that I'm in the minority on this, but I still think 4 teams is the way to go. Obviously, we're not always going to have a year like we're having right now. Okay, plain and simple. This time next year, we could have some three loss or 4 loss teams arguing as far as having a spot in the college football playoff. But nonetheless, that's the way it is. It's all about a money grab. It's all about the excitement of the postseason. But when it's all said and done, you'd be hard pressed to not keep or to keep rather an SEC champion out of the playoff, and you'd be hard pressed to keep this Alabama Crimson Tide out of the field of four. But folks, that's going to wrap it up. This is William Martin signing off, saying thanks again for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. Always appreciate the support. Always appreciate the love. Be well, everybody, and have a good one.